Courageous Conversations was launched in 2020 in the midst of the racial reckoning following the death of George Floyd, Regis Karpinski-Paquette, in order to have conversations around difficult and contentious issues that were happening and around which we needed to increase knowledge and awareness. So, for example, around systemic racism, around racial profiling, and around efforts to come to terms with what is to be done. We found two people who inspired these kinds of conversations historically and today, one of whom is Violet King, a Calgarian who became the first Black woman lawyer, and the other was Maya Angelou, the African-American author and poet who said that courage is the most important virtue because without courage, you cannot do anything else consistently. What inspires me is having the conversations with these leading thinkers from across campus, the country, and around the world who have been thinking deeply about these issues, who have been engaged with social justice movements, with university communities, with other intellectuals and activists, with an aim not just for understanding, but also for thinking about how that understanding can be mobilized in order to affect sustainable change. My name is Melinda Smith, and I'm the Vice Provost for Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and the Associate Vice President for Research, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion here at the University of Calgary. Thank you for joining us for this joint You Flourish and Courageous Conversation presentation with Dr. Randy Boyagoda. On behalf of Dr. Andrew Sito, who unfortunately could not be here, and the campus community mental health and well-being team, including Sasha Savoy, especially, I would like to welcome you to the event, Thinking Out Loud Together, Why Civil Discourse Matters on Our Campuses Now More Than Ever. To start the conversation off in a good way, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Calgary is located in the heart of Southern Alberta, in the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Pikunai, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina First Nations, as well as the Stoney Nakoda, Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Goodstoney's First Nation. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 5 and 6. The University of Calgary is situated on land northwest of where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, a site traditionally known as Mohkinstsis. To the Blackfoot, Winchipah to the Nakota, and Gutisi to the Tsuut'ina, on the land and in this place, we strive to learn together, walk together, and grow together in a good way. I would now like to introduce to you Jessica Smith. As we were joking, we are sisters from another mother, shall we say. Jessica Smith is the lead helper for the Elders Knowledge Circle Society. The Elders Knowledge Circle Society, as outlined on the overhead, emerged from a long-held desire amongst Indigenous elders in Calgary and an area to establish a centralized place for knowledge and wisdom where elders from different nations could become a resource that is preserved, protected, and shared to the benefit of all, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, the spirit and intent of reconciliation. So in the context of University of Calgary, in terms of our parallel paths. It has been developed through a parallel process that builds on the principle of ethical space, which you can find also in our Indigenous strategy, Etapato. And also it's in terms of this paralleling the Indigenous and non-Indigenous systems, influencing the development of Indigenous strategies within the community and Calgary and area. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jessica Smith to the podium.
Buzu, Anin, Indijnaka, Nagamoin, Mashwada, Bijakekwe. I'm also really tall and I don't like touching these things because I'll mess them up. All right. Hello, Anin, I see your light. My name is Singing Buffalo Woman, Anishinaabe, British and Irish. My name is Jessica Smith. It's my given name from my mom. My traditional name was given to me by Elder Daryl Brass and Linda Brass. Sorry, I am a shy person, so when I am asked to sit in these spaces, this is not my forte. However, my elder, Dr. Reg Crowshoe, asked me to come and open us up in a good way today. And when my elders ask me to step forward, I oblige. So I learned a little bit over the last couple days about this event, and I am honored and blessed to have been asked to come to open. I'm grateful to take this time with each of you this afternoon, and I ask you to sit in this space with one another in relation with open hearts. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that I walk this week with a heavy heart myself. With the passing of Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair. He was somebody who trailblazed these kinds of conversations, difficult and uncomfortable conversations, and at times was in spaces that maybe he wasn't welcome in. And so it is paramount that we sit in these moments and we sit in that discomfort and learn how to do that in a good way. We also laid to rest our elder John Chief Moon Sr., and he was a leader who walked us through reconciliation in a gentle way. And so I always want to make sure to honor those who've come before us and have taught me and many of us so very much. I have to keep notes because I also have a gift of gab. And if I went off track, we'd be here all day and nobody would have anything to say. So one of the things I think about when we lose our elders and in the work that I do is that when they're gone, we lose a library, a living library. And it is so incredibly important that we gather not just one another in this way with people from all walks of life, from all ages, because we ourselves are walking libraries and each of us have gifts to bring into that space. And so I want to just acknowledge that component of this gathering and the way in which we sit in relation with one another and we make relatives, because it's not just us sitting and listening, we're building connection, and then you become my relative in that connection. So we are blessed to wake up this morning and have another breath and actually be able to sit in this discomfort today and have these conversations and learn. And so with that, I say miigwech, and I say I shall see you all again. And I offer, my knowledge within this space. I didn't share anything about the EKC, and I don't know if that's something that you wanted me to do, but this is what happens when you get nervous. So, but the Elders Knowledge Circle is not just a role that I hold. I don't separate myself when I walk in that space. And so I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the Elders Knowledge Circle. And we're a group of 33 multi-nation elders from Treaty 7 and beyond that come together with a mission to preserve knowledge, to preserve language for our future generations. And so I am merely an infant in that space. I don't claim to be anything other than that. And I am walking into this space in that way. And so with that, I say hand to heart to each of you today, miigwech, and I hope that this conversation is meaningful and that you take that away to your respective spaces. All my relations.
I so love meeting Smiths. There's so few of us in the world. So I'd also like to thank interpreters Sandra Kuha and Lisa May, who will be signing for us throughout the day. I'm not going to, well, I guess I should reference this. As the video highlighted, Courageous Conversations is a speaker series that started in November 2020. I started here at University of Alberta in August 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. And one of the mandates that I was given, as you will recall, it was in the aftermath of George Floyd. There was a lot of discussions and concerns about anti-Black racism. It was in the midst of Black Lives Matter, but also there was discussions emerging in that context about Me Too, and questions about the role of universities and the wider community in the pursuit of social justice, if you will, in a fair society. But one of the threads beneath all of it was, what exactly is the role of the university in all of this? And universities are sites of knowledge, production, but they're also places, unlike any other institution in the society, perhaps in the world, where you have the immense diversity of the population and the globe gathered in one place. No other institution is quite like that. And with that comes a diversity of people, ideas, ways of knowing, ways of being, profound differences, but also profound opportunities. And as we become institutions characterized by hyper diversity, not just diversity, people talked about, there's identity diversity, but also cognitive diversity, diversity of lifestyles, diversity of knowledges and ways of engaging. They also become sites for potential, well, they have always been sites of conflict. You can't think of the great Socrates agitating people in the marketplace or any other, my background is political philosophy, so any other philosopher throughout time who haven't tried to upset or should we say disrupt the prevailing order. So in these sites, this debate and contestations are not novel. And so I just want to say that as a starting point, what we are gathered here to talk about is something that it's a perennial issue. But nonetheless, it's one that we are constantly invited to reflect upon and to think about how we navigate it in a good way. And so I think the You Flourish and Courageous Conversation together, our combined effort is for us to think about how we as a society, a campus and a society, grapple with the challenges of our time and how we can learn from the past, but also perhaps this moment calls for us to think about doing things differently and to learn to think about how to do things better. So Courageous Conversation this year focused on togetherness quite deliberately. And so along with You Flourish, which focuses on well-being, which just launched its new strategy, I couldn't think of, thanks to Sasha, of course, a more fitting speaker to grapple with the challenges of our time. Dr. Randy Boyagoda is here to discuss the crucial role that civil discourse plays within academic institutions, but also why civil discourse is more than polite conversation or grappling with mere disagreements, but why there's something much more fundamental to it. Through this discussion, we hope to learn together, to recognize, respect, to find ways to wrestle with sometimes profound disagreements about how to disagree, perhaps without being unduly disagreeable, how to disagree in ways that allow us to preserve our dignity and our humanity and find ways to live, learn, and work well together. We hope that by the end of our time together, you will see civil discourse as an invaluable tool or a means of thinking out loud together, using it to find ways to grapple with division, to find ways and resolution to think about how to resolve conflict and how to foster collaboration, not for the self, but in our collective interests, for the societal good, for the public good. Because not only does your and my well-being and survival depend on it, we are, to quote Martin Luther King, inextricably bound in a web of mutuality. And really, whatever impacts you impacts me and us in similar ways. So finding ways for civil discourse is part of our collective well-being. So let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Randy Boyagoda is the advisor on civil discourse for the University of Toronto. I think the only one in Canada. Okay, so let's give it up for a very brave soul, where he's also a professor of English and vice dean. And I must say, I find that as someone who loves literature quite lovely as well. And I'm actually, I think there's a connection here between what you do and how you do it, but also the poetry you bring to the work. He was also undergraduate, so professor of English and vice dean undergraduate at the Faculty of Arts and Science. He's the author of numerous books, and he regularly contributes essays, reviews, and opinions to a variety of publications, including he's appeared on CBC radio. You have a podcast, I discovered. So if you haven't, we will share it when we send out the notice of the video of the event. And also you can find some quite extraordinary and informative interviews with him on CBC, I think on the Toronto Star and elsewhere. But I can go on and on about what has been a remarkable career that continues under this moment. But without further ado, the reason why we're here, and the person we're here to listen to, Dr. Randy Boyagoda.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you here today at the University of Calgary and to, in a sense, think out loud together with you about the state of civil discourse on campuses, the stakes for it, and why it matters, both in our shared lives in university communities and then beyond it. Yikes. Why would you want to do something like that? Are they punishing you? That sounds awful. That has to be the worst position at a university right now. I'm glad someone has this job, and I'm glad it's not me. Good luck. Be careful. Those two were from my mother. And finally, is this a promotion, or are they getting ready to fire you? People often tell me that I have a terrible, terrifying job. I am, as you know, the University of Toronto's advisor on civil discourse. And in an age where it does feel like it's easier just to talk to people who already agree with you, an age that provides little space for reconsideration, for considering other perspectives, for meeting people in the middle about ideas, issues of shared concern, a civil discourse advisor might seem as necessary as it feels impossible. It's not. At least this hasn't been my experience since January 2024 when I took on the role. In my sense, in my experience, people do want to talk to each other, or at least they want other people to be talking to each other. Put differently, everyone agrees with the idea of civil discourse, and everyone is suspicious or terrified of the reality of it. But keeping difficult conversations going, this has been what I've been trying to do as U of T's advisor on civil discourse. I was invited to take on this work because of my background as a faculty member in English, as a novelist, as the former president of PEN Canada, the literary organization that defends freedom of expression, celebrates literature, and aids writers in peril. Beyond all of that, my teaching and writing focuses often on the work of Salman Rushdie, and in particular his novel Satanic Verses. I'm especially interested in what I describe as the public life of books. What does it mean to think about a book as this object that can have a great deal of personal significance for you, or have a great deal of significance in the context of a literary community or a classroom, when that same object suddenly becomes an instrument of geopolitical chaos and the source of violence and the source of great division? How do we understand the role of literature when it can have this dual role in a democratic society? That's something that I'm interested in as a teacher and as a researcher and a writer. And I think that, alongside some of the other things I've pointed out, and also, frankly, probably the fact that I'm a university administrator, have informed my taking on this role as a civil discourse advisor. I'm very happy to be with you here today at the University of Calgary under the auspices of your You Flourish and Courageous Conversations programs. One of my closest colleagues at U of T completed her PhD at the University of Calgary. And when I told her that I was coming, she told me that what she found most enjoyable and useful about her time here was the dedication of faculty to mentoring their graduate students, both in their studies and afterwards. And then she said that she benefited from and joined in what she described as the, quote, can-do attitude of people at the University of Calgary. Now, if indeed that remains the case, I'm excited to hear what you can do when it comes to civil discourse. Indeed, it seems altogether consistent with the mission statement of this university, which commits to offering students an education that, quote, prepares them for life and prepares them to help address society's most persistent challenges, unquote. Now, I think this matters in global ways, in national ways, and in local ways. And one of my own interests in being with you today is to learn more from you about what you see as both the irreducibly local challenges to civil discourse here at Calgary, and in turn, whether you can point to irreducibly local ways of overcoming those challenges. Now, let me add, I'm very happy to be with you here today in person. I know we could have done this virtually, and I don't know about the rest of you, but it's a different experience. It's a different encounter. At a certain point during the pandemic, I had a novel come out, and at that stage, I was doing a lot of online literary events, and I got so used to it. And at one point, I was doing an event, and one of my daughters happened to be watching from elsewhere in our locked-in house, and she texted me, "Dad, you can see ESPN.com reflected in your glasses." Because, of course, I was there to talk about the significance of Dante and making sense of contemporary America, but I was reading about Notre Dame football the entire time. I couldn't do that right now. or I really shouldn't do that right now. That wouldn't strike me as a very courageous way to be with you. So I'm glad we are here in person. And something I'm going to say perhaps a little later is that I think some of the atomizing effects of the pandemic are contributing factors to some of the challenges we have today with civil discourse. But I'll say more about that in a moment. More immediately, I think what I'd like to say is that while it's self-evident that societies, and more specifically university campuses across our country and around the world, have been confronted with challenges when it comes to something like being willing and able to think out loud together, it seems to me that right now, the most difficult feature of this is having a conversation with the people immediately around you, especially when you don't know how it's going to turn out. That seems to me, especially for students, to be a source of great anxiety and uncertainty, where I would have been, I think as an undergraduate, someone who was excited by the fact that I didn't know how something was going to turn out. And it seems to me that maybe one thing we can think through together as part of our conversation today is whether this is just a generational thing, and anyone who once went to university and then returned always already says it's not like it used to be when I was there, or if in fact there is something that has changed, and that sense of being excited at uncertainty versus anxious about uncertainty, if there's a way that we can maybe create better conditions to move towards excitement, if you would agree with me that that's a good thing to have as part of a university experience. I think it's hard, though, for lots of reasons. In fact, I think what I hope we can figure out today, a little at least, is how to create more capacity and space for the uncertain and the curious in a very polarized and binary feeling time. Because I think if institutions like the University of Calgary can't sustain such capacity and space for its own community, if the university is captive only instead to those with strong, loud, and fixed views, or completely ignored by large swaths of apathetic people, I think our institutions risk losing fidelity to their core mission and work while coming across as either less relevant or more partisan, or both, to the communities and the greater public, and I say this in the context of Canadian higher education, government. Civil discourse, rightly understood, can, I think, be a corrective against this problem. But let me begin by making one thing clear. Civil discourse isn't about rules and tactics for being polite with each other. Dr. Smith, you'd mentioned as much part of your remarks. Civil discourse can be heated, even angry. Sometimes it should be, given the stakes of what's being discussed. But I propose that as long as you affirm as paramount the inherent dignity of the other person you are engaged with, as long as you're really trying to reach a better understanding of that person, their worldview, or of the issue you are discussing, rather than just shouting them down, I think it's okay to proceed, even if what you're saying and how you say it is impassioned, even fiery. To my mind, civil discourse is a commitment to thinking out loud together. It's a shared effort focused on ideas and issues of interest and concern that recognizes and reckons with difference and disagreement. I propose to you that when people are sincerely invested in civil discourse, so defined, difference and disagreement can lead to increases of mutual and also shared understanding. In all of these ways, civil discourse supports the advance of knowledge, the pursuit of truth, and it serves the common good. Now, generally speaking, people respond relatively well to this account of civil discourse and why it matters, if also in some instances pointing to some issues with civil discourse itself. One would be the power dynamics inherent in civil discourse itself, within a classroom, between tenured and untenured faculty, between faculty and administration, between faculty and staff, administration and staff. In all of these settings, there are inherent power dynamics and hierarchies. And it seems to me that part of the courage that's involved in university leadership especially is not hiding that, not pretending otherwise, not engaging in a false humility. Oh, it's just me, the tenured lifetime professor at U of T. What do I know? I guess we all have the same ability to speak out here. I find that obnoxious when we do that. It comes out of a deep guilt that professors have about winning the lottery ticket of life and then wanting to kind of perform a kind of false humility that masks the inherent power dynamics and hierarchies. Let's just acknowledge that they are there and then work within that acknowledgement rather than pretending otherwise and performing, I think, sometimes otherwise. So that's one problem with civil discourse, power. The other is the term itself, that it comes out of intellectual and cultural traditions that are presumptively Western, that build on exclusionary principles associated with racism and settler colonialism, that it is a form of control. Civil, in other words, is the key word intended to suggest you can only engage here if you engage according to some unwritten rules and norms that you have to be in a position of privilege already to understand and to be able to negotiate. Those are the criticisms I very much hear about the term civil discourse. I've heard it from people in academia, my own institution, workplaces, and public life in Canada, around the world over the past few months. And to these concerns, I freely acknowledge the challenge of terminology. I acknowledge the way that words can have meanings beyond their intention. Now, I counter that it's absurd to pretend that other terminology is itself pristinely free of other kinds of bias, that different framing doesn't bring with it its own set of unintended exclusions. But finally, I suggest to you, I don't really care what we call this thing. If people are willing and able to think out loud together, to have rigorous, difficult conversations, that's a good thing. And so that would be my understanding of some of the challenges inherent to the nature of civil discourse itself. But again, I don't care what we call it. If people are more willing and able to approach difficult conversations with curiosity, with openness, with a desire to learn more at the end of a conversation than you did at the beginning, whether about the other person, the subject under discussion, or yourself, ideally all three. Now, as I'd said before, everyone agrees with more or less what I'm suggesting as a good idea in the abstract. Things change when the issues and ideas become specific and concrete. Everyone here knows that the state and stakes for civil discourse became dramatically clear over the past year, as higher education campuses across Canada and the United States and various public spaces around the world have been convulsed by protests and interpersonal discord, as well as dramatic, divisive encampments. All of this followed the October 7, 2023 Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's subsequent and ongoing bombings and military campaign in Gaza and elsewhere, while the United Nations and many countries have called for humanitarian ceasefires and increasingly taken up the cause of Palestinian rights and statehood. The corrosion of this conversation, of course, predates the current war. Put differently, it's not as if civil discourse on our campuses was thriving and robust on October 6th, 2023, and then suddenly everything changed 24 hours later. It seems to me that instead, what has happened on our campuses after October 7th revealed, perhaps deepened, but revealed what has been in place for several years, which is a curbing, a moving away from rigorous disagreements with others for any number of reasons. Only now is the greater public, perhaps, taking notice of it in a fresh way. Everyone agrees, then, that the state of civil discourse has reached new lows in recent years, but debates over the subject have a long and telling history, and specifically in relation to higher education. The first use of the term in the English language dates to 1605. That was the first time someone used the phrase, so far as we can tell, civil discourse. It was in a work called On Learning by the English philosopher Sir Francis Bacon, who observed, quote, "Amongst so many great colleges in Europe, I find it strange that they are all dedicated to professions, and none left free to arts and sciences at large. There is no university education which is free, where students might give themselves to study history, modern languages, books of policy, and civil discourse." In other words, The very first time the term civil discourse appears in the West, it's in a complaint about what universities are failing to teach their students. This was over 400 years ago. In other words, it seems to me, we only talk about civil discourse in its absence. When people are actually engaged in rigorous, difficult conversation, they're not worried about what it's called. But when it's absent, suddenly we start to name it, but we name it because it's absent. And this past spring, I did a research project with some undergraduates at U of T, one of whom offered I think it's called a Google Ngram analysis of, certain phrases when they show up in publicly available information, media, books, journalism. And what he revealed was that the term, 1605 onward, kind of does this. And then during the Vietnam War and the free speech debates and protests in the United States in the 1960s, it spiked. And then it went down. And then in the 1980s, during the time of the anti-apartheid movement and protests on university campuses, it spiked again, then went down. November 2016, it spiked again, and it stayed up, and it's only gone up since then. But again, if you think about this, it happens when something happens in the world at large that puts pressure on university communities to be able to have a conversation, a difficult conversation with each other, and it doesn't feel like it's working out. In fact, if you agree that we tend to talk about civil discourse most when it's most in decline, perhaps the best way to understand this is something that a U of T colleague observed when she found out about my appointment. She said, "You know your university has a problem with civil discourse when they hire someone to do it." Now, the key is I can't do it alone, nor can you here at the University of Calgary or in your lives beyond campus, because unless you're a performance artist, it is impossible to think out loud together by yourself. As from my own experience, admittedly with a few notable exceptions, it has not been easy to find others as yet willing to do this with me, students and professors alike, in public settings. This makes sense. I have cover. They don't. In fact, as I reflect on the consistent ways that people tend to respond to news of my job, it's terrible, are they getting ready to fire you, et cetera, I think actually people may have it wrong. It's super easy to commit to civil discourse when it's your job title, as opposed to wanting to do it because you think it's good and important and essential to the life and work of the university or your workplace or a shared public setting. I have cover. You expect this from me. But if you don't have cover that way, but you still want to pursue it, I think it's much more difficult. I will say, by association to this, Harvard University recently released a report about a month ago now on difficult conversations on campus, their version of a civil discourse project. It's publicly available. And one of the notable features of that report were professors and students self-reporting the main reason why they aren't as willing to dissent in classrooms or academic settings, why they're not willing to raise a difficult question. It's fear of peer attitudes, of what the people around them will think of them. Notice, not cancellation, not getting tenure or not getting a grant, but the kind of quiet perceived social pressure of feeling like the people around you won't like you anymore, won't want to be associated with you anymore if you're on the wrong side of something. That was self-reporting. It certainly resonates with what I'm hearing at the University of Toronto. In fact, I had a rather direct experience of this years ago, not named as such, as a faculty member. I was attending a dinner on campus in a grand old dining hall, dark carved wood, stained glass windows, elaborate Gothic stonework. That said, the spicy chicken burger I got at Carl's over in the Student Center, it was frankly more memorable than the kind of overheated beef that I had in that dining hall. But that time I was dining with a group of undergraduates. We were discussing ideas. We were doing so outside the classroom. This wasn't for credit. This wasn't an assignment. This wasn't something to add to a transcript or a co-curricular transcript or a CV. This was a group of thoughtful, curious young people thinking out loud together in a beautiful setting. Again, resonant with something Dr. Smith had just said, where else but at a university can this kind of transformative experience happen? This transformative shared experience. The subject of cultural appropriation came up. Now, while there have definitely been situations where an artist or an institution has appropriated someone else's culture for personal or institutional gain, to my mind, we shouldn't all be limited only to our own cultures as sources for inspiration in art making. I think as a writer, this would place too narrow, too final a limit on the range and power of the imagination. That was my initial position. One of the students at the dinner had a very different position. She insisted on an absolute prohibition against any form of cultural appropriation when it came to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous experience. She was unwilling to consider any alternative viewpoint or break from that position. The more I proposed alternatives or raised questions about the deeper implications of her view, the firmer and more animated, even impassioned, she became. And while all of this was happening, I experienced a deep sense of gratitude. To myself, I was thinking, yes, this is what university is all about. Here we are in this beautiful dining hall, breaking bread, thinking out loud together about ideas and issues that matter. But then I noticed something. Sitting beside the student I was speaking with was another student. They were filming us with their phone. The feeling of gratitude I'd had just moments earlier vanished. In its place, I felt anxiety, even dread. Speaking as a university administrator, I saw this red light start beeping, and it was my career longevity light. It was just beeping with a big warning. I felt the need to stop talking. I felt the need to change the subject. Why? Here I was, a senior university administrator and tenured professor, going back and forth with a young female student of color on a subject about which she was getting increasingly exercised, while I appeared to be enjoying myself. Now, I had no idea how this exchange was going to be edited or shared, what would happen if it went online. And again, I have tenure. I'm fine. It's not that worry. There's a worry beyond that. There's a worry of the kind of social cost of being caught out a certain way. And even if it goes online and it gets 3 views, and all 3 are from University of Toronto Communications, even still, something is out there beyond my control that represents me in a way that causes great anxiety, because it represents me in a way that allows others to see me as a bad actor. Regardless of context, regardless of intention, I come across as a bad actor in that exchange. So guess what? I started talking about the roles and how warm they were. I changed the subject completely. I lament this, and I don't lament it again simply out of career viability. The point I want to emphasize now and here is that I don't have a complete view of cultural appropriation. I wasn't interested in convincing the student that I was discussing it with to give up on her view and agree with mine. Instead, I was hoping that by thinking out loud together, as we were doing, in ways that were spirited, that were argumentative and intense, we might reach a new and better set of possible answers to the question of cultural appropriation. Failing that, we might at least better understand a different position and value the person who is coming to you with that position. None of that happened, because without permission or explanation, someone had started filming us. And what was clear to me in that moment was that I had a very different understanding of what it meant to have a conversation on a campus than the student filming our conversation did. I don't think the person was being a jerk. I don't think they were trying to catch me. I just think they very naturally thought, oh, look at this. This is kind of dramatic and exciting and fun. I'm going to get out my phone and film it. I assign no ill motive to the person, just a fundamentally different understanding of how to have a conversation with others. All of which brings to mind for me one of my favorite lines from the Satanic Verses. Salman Rushdie describes the modern city where, quote, as a place where, quote, incompatible realities sit side by side on the bus. I wonder if universities have become just such places. incompatible realities sitting side by side. Places marked not by arguments and debates alongside conflicts and protests, which have always been with universities, but also, I think, at this stage, by fundamentally different, even incompatible ideas and expectations of what a university is, what it's for, and what it means for someone to be part of it. For as long as universities have existed, there have been arguments about their purpose. I'll add that for critics of higher education, and particularly for politicians looking to score points with a skeptical public, there can be very satisfying failures of correspondence between ideas and realities of the university. In other words, and I suspect many of you know this, some people only want to see what's gone wrong with universities, which often involves pointing to evidence of out-of-touch elites, educations that have little relevance beyond campus, and double standards for treatment for various members of the school's community. In my role as U of T's advisor on civil discourse, I work with faculty, students, and staff to establish the state for civil discourse to make a case for its significance to the mission and work of the university. It involves bringing external speakers to campus and a series of consultations with students, faculty, staff, academic leaders, and alumni. This past week, I spent 21 hours in consultations with colleagues on our 3 campuses at U of T. And perhaps in the conversation I can say a little bit, obviously without attribution, but in a generalized way about what I noticed. But what I can tell you, and I'll be curious if it resonates here, are a couple of things immediately. One would be a fundamental lack of trust between administration, faculty, and students. That would be straight up. The second would be an inability to understand the administration as made up of a group of colleagues. Instead, it's this kind of concrete-faced message box. No one at U of T is watching this, are they? No, this is just for Calgary. Hey everybody, tenure. Okay, so this is the perception, in other words, of the administration. And then the other, and I will say this very specifically, I've heard this just as much from Jewish colleagues as I have from colleagues who are very much committed to the Palestinian cause, not feeling seen or heard. As someone who's listening, it's almost remarkable the doubling that happens. Again, to be reductive, quote unquote, both sides are convinced that no one sees or hears their concerns at the level that they want them to be. And I think that's probably the case, at the level they want them to be. But that sense that you're not seen or heard with these concerns. And then the other observation I would make based on what I've heard so far would be a sense to some degree of skepticism or frustration, not with the principles of EDI, but with their application and the way in which that can sometimes cause a chill or a challenge to rigorous dissent and disagreement. If that's of interest, I'm sure many of you know this already, I would point to the recent New York Times Magazine article on the University of Michigan and its DEI project. There's certainly been some dissenting responses to it that are also worth taking a look at. But the one component of that interests me would be the self-reporting on the part of faculty and students that they have been less willing to voice a minority view or dissent at the same time that the application of EDI principles in the form of reports and investigations has increased. The more there's a sense that that's happening, the less people are willing to think out loud with others in our classrooms. That seems to me like a set of competing principles for most contemporary institutions that needs to be resolved somehow. And I would love to hear if there's a way, but for me, one of them will win out against the other, it seems to me. I don't see how they can be harmonized because I think there is a pretty direct conflict between them, at least as it's being currently iterated on our campuses. Now, that having been said, I don't think this means that we should give up on universities as places where civil discourse can be cultivated and sustained. Instead, it seems to me that we should at least focus on the one thing that anyone in a university space shares, and this I take from the French philosopher Blaise Pascal, who suggested in his 1670 book Pensée that, quote, "It is thinking that constitutes the greatness of the human being. Only a reed, the most fragile thing in the world, but a reed that thinks. Our whole dignity consists in thinking. It is by thinking that we must elevate ourselves." This idea resonates profoundly with me, particularly as someone who spent the better part of his life at a university, as a student, as a professor, as an administrator, as a novelist who often writes about campus life. Because I believe that an important purpose of higher education is to affirm and even defend this wholeness of human dignity as consisting in thinking. Now, that said, I've had to move beyond that idea through the consultations I've been having with colleagues. Why? Because what they'll say is, Randy, that's great, and it's all up here. You're not thinking about the fullness of a person in a moment. I heard this especially in a convincing way from my colleagues in the Faculty of Nursing, who said, as nurses, it's not here. You encounter people in a nursing setting, you encounter their wholeness, you encounter their emotional lives, their psychological lives. And if you aren't willing to reckon with all of that, then you really are creating preconditions for who can join these conversations, calm people who can make jokes to make things work out okay for themselves as they continue to have difficult conversations from a position of great security. So I hear that. So as much as Pascal resonates with me, I acknowledge there's more to thinking out loud together than thinking out loud together, if that makes sense. It sounds, in fact, in many ways, almost romantic, what I'm suggesting, and indeed even old-fashioned. But I still think, though, that there is a core good to that kind of willingness to think out loud with others. One of the challenges with it, I think, right now that we're all facing are generational differences of expectation about why, what, and how we spend time together on university campuses. And as I said at the beginning, I think, at least for the present generation of undergraduates, there was a formative loss of embodied encounters person to person during the pandemic. I think as a result of that, if you think about it, if we lived during a period where we were all told learning by yourself remotely is the best way to serve the common good and help others, if you're formed by that at a kind of crucial point in your learning life, or as a junior faculty member, a graduate student moving into the profession, suddenly being around others who, in their embodied ways, may disagree with you, is a great challenge. And it's a challenge that does what? That encourages you to keep your head down because you want to get tenure, to keep your head down because you're worried about a rec letter. It's just not worth it, in other words. And again, that is, to my mind, one of the key challenges we face in our institutions is to try to make a case it is worth it. So how do we make the case that it is worth it? But beyond these individual and large-scale barriers to civil discourse, another, beyond atomization, would be surveillance, the sense that you are being watched, and you are being watched either by students with their phones, by your fellow students, or by the university, which is listening in as we speak, which is recording this, which is going to use it for purposes that you don't have control over. That sense of surveillance is something else that I think we all are aware of and self-conscious about when it comes to how we respond to the opportunity for a difficult conversation with others. And I would say that the great challenge, sorry, I lost my page. Here we are. The great challenge that we face with civil discourse then would be to make a case in turn for what is known as epistemic humility. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. We have to find the right places and spaces for difficult or courageous conversations. I think one example that I would raise is I was asked repeatedly during our 47-day encampment at the University of Toronto, what my role was going to be as the civil discourse person. And to my mind, that's sort of like asking someone to go walk into a forest fire and say, "Hi, I'm here to give you a fire safety demonstration." In other words, it would have been obnoxious for me to say, "Hey, let's have a productive, difficult conversation, everyone." It doesn't, I don't think, do justice. It doesn't do justice to the seriousness of the commitments of the people in that encampment and what they were advocating for. It also would inevitably require, again, a certain kind of, well, here's how we're going to do it. But the very fact of a protest taking the form of an encampment is a demonstration that the normal pathways for university disagreement weren't working for the people who were committed that way. So the question then becomes, how do we make sense of moving beyond that form of protest back into some kind of shared space or shared understanding? In order to do that, I am working with colleagues across the university, including a working group that I chair, to create conditions for faculty and students alike to approach campus life with what I'll describe as a governing disposition for civil discourse, an openness to it, an openness as much mind and heart to a difficult conversation, as opposed to webinar workshops on having a difficult conversation. That's not going to work, and anyone who signs up for one doesn't need any help with civil discourse. So I would say it's a matter of ensuring the right frame for what we are doing. And it's not easy. I'll say two other observations on that front before closing and then turning to our conversation. This will surprise no one in this room because you are all parts of it. You're all members of a university. This working group that we have is 15 faculty and students from across the university, different disciplines, different worldviews, knowledge experiences, et cetera, et cetera. And what I said to them at the beginning was, if the 16 of us can't disagree productively in this room, if we can't think out loud together here, how can we expect 100,000 people across 3 campuses in a 4 million person world city to do so? It's not plausible. And it's impossible to imagine kind of writ large solutions. These things have to be local. They have to make sense with the people around you in a shared community where there are levels of trust, where there are levels of familiarity that can allow for mistakes, that can allow for going a little further than you might find comfortable in order to get to a better understanding of a place. So this group, we were together for the first 6 months. 6 months, 6 or 8 hours of meetings just to agree to a definition of civil discourse. And we failed to agree to a definition of civil discourse. But what came of the exercise was a great deal more trust and investment in being there with each other, even if, again, no cue violins, it didn't all work out in the end. But you knew someone who has a very different worldview than you. You broke bread with them. You had lunch with them once a month, and you talked about these things with each other. That was very important for that group, and something I'm very grateful to have been part of. But it seems to me, as I kind of reach my conclusion here, that that very effort required a willingness to practice epistemic humility. It seems to me, as a member of a university community, if you approach your time in this space as offering an array of opportunities to learn, to create, to discover, none of it can be done alone, and all of it requires epistemic humility. This is a term that comes to us from Michael Spence, a legal scholar and the president of University College London. He defines epistemic humility this way: an openness to the possibility that I might be wrong, even about my most passionate convictions, and when I believe those convictions to flow from my own experience. For some, this is a much more difficult task than for others, perhaps even impossible. How difficult it is often stems from what I perceive to be the relative power of the various participants in a given dialogue. If my passionate convictions flow from experience that I regard as identity forming, and if that identity and experience has entailed being oppressed or rendered powerless, then being asked even to entertain the possibility that I might be wrong seems like a form of oppression. But it is hard to imagine, Spence concludes, how genuine engagement can happen across difference unless I approach it with at least some willingness to conceive that my understanding might be incomplete or even wrong. This approach, this willingness, defines epistemic humility. But leave aside Israel and Palestine, sex and gender, truth and reconciliation, climate change, the future of democracy. Leave all of it aside. Leave civil discourse-related challenges about these subjects aside. Epistemic humility is hard and it's risky. But I'd like to say in closing, it's a risk that I think we all need to consider. In a 2024 review of threats to social cohesion and democratic resilience, Great Britain's Dame Sarah Khan observes that, quote, unlike acute high-risk threats such as terrorism or other national security concerns, many of the social cohesion threats facing societies are chronic, insidious, and sit below the radar, where they are not assessed, measured, or even understood. What happens to these in the context of a university community? What happens to the unspoken thoughts, the unasked questions? I think for young people, for students, this kind of self-containment can gradually wither their desire and capacities for hard thinking, or the thoughts they perceive as unwelcome or dissenting from a solid-seeming consensus can fester into resentment or mutate into cruder forms and cruder settings than at campus. As for faculty, who likewise limit their participation in free and demanding intellectual exchange, their own thinking will become increasingly circumscribed, self-confirming, stale. The potential consequences are high when it comes to civil discourse. Because universities without strong cultures in this area, I think, fall prey to sustaining research and preparing students to address society's most pressing challenges, to reach back to your university's mission statement, in self-limiting ways, while sending the people that they serve into professional and public life less willing, less able to live out the freedom of thought and speech integral to a healthy democratic culture. Now, I know that sounds dire. I think it is dire. But we shouldn't run the risk of practicing civil discourse on campus just because it's a good civic deed, or because it's good for research and teaching, or because it helps us address the critics of the university. I think we should run that risk because of the great human and humane reward of pursuing knowledge and truth, and every now and then actually finding it. Everything good that happens in a university happens ultimately because of that. Everyone in this room can, I hope, remember at least one moment in your lives at a university where you didn't know something, and then you did. That's the moment when the idea of a university and the reality of a university become one. We are, as Blaise Pascal said, fragile and temporary as reeds, but we are thinking reeds, feeling reeds. The rush of newness, of discovery, the struggle, even the pain of feeling stretched and changed, maybe even transformed, none of that would be possible for any of us had we not made the decision to place ourselves in positions of epistemic humility, incomplete understanding, of knowing this about ourselves, accepting it about ourselves, and wanting to do something about it, which is to say, to think out loud together. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that really insightful conversation. Rich, it's like I don't want to watch the video again. I want to read the paper. But I want to go back to a point I made earlier, but you also emphasized, which is to say there's something not very new and yet very new about this current moment. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me of something, that little pamphlet of Hegel's, the one thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. Mm. And here's why I want to preface my remarks with that. So we can think about, Hobbes or even Machiavelli. They all had similar kinds of troubles with universities or the context in which they operated. We could fast forward to the whole debate about hot button issues. Mm-hmm. We could think about the debates around, I'm old enough to think about the debates around apartheid on campus and opposition to it. And now we're talking about cancel culture, snowflakes, tone policing, echo chambers. What is the difference between that? If you were to try to think about the difference between those earlier conversations and the current moment, what's the difference that's making a difference? Or is it that and I do have an idea. I'll come back to it, but it's not just the videotape or the people being recorded or the social media. But there is something different about the university today than in that earlier period that makes these kinds of conversations more challenging than, say, in the moment of Machiavelli or Hobbes, or even, is it Bacon that you cited? Bacon, 1604? Yeah, 1604, see? Yeah. 400 years.
It's still
complaining. It's still complaining. So what's the difference?
I would say what year was the University of Calgary founded? Anybody know? 1966. Thank you. It would be curious to imagine this exact same event taking place in 1966. And I'm going to predict neither of us would be sitting here, as one thing, and that this audience would look very different as well. There is, I think, an undeniable good, let's just put it out there, to a certain kind of homogeneity. If you've all come from the same place, gone to the same schools, worship at the same places, there is an inborn familiarity and trust that's built. But that trust presupposes certain kinds of exclusions, I guess you could say. And so I think the difference is that universities were able to sustain difficult conversations in a time when universities were themselves far more homogenous. And I don't simply mean by that homogenous when it comes to race or point of origin. I think it's also the case when it comes to class. And that seems to me, in other words, is it really diverse if my dad is the Sri Lankan ambassador to the UN, and then therefore I'm the diverse voice in the room, even though I've gone to international schools? My father's a high school chemistry teacher from Oshawa. He wasn't the UN ambassador. But you take my point. One other way that maybe I'll explain it would be that I am often told about the success of Dartmouth College since last October in sustaining an ongoing dialogue, a public dialogue on its campus about Israel and Palestine. It started in mid-October and it just keeps on going. And whenever I'm told about that, Randy, why can't we do that at U of T? I think, because we're not 3,000 rich people living in the New England woods, Again, there would be a great deal of racial diversity there, but otherwise it's pretty homogenous if you really think about elite higher education as the context. And so I think in spaces that have some level of baseline homogeneity by whatever standard, you can have a more productive, difficult conversation. It's not Calgary. It's certainly not U of T. So the question becomes, how can you do it in that age, in that space? And then the other point I would make simply is that the speed with which something happening off campus affects people on campus is unprecedented, I would say, in terms of an international event affecting you both because you're consuming it on your phone or because you have family there or you have friends there. I think that's also a net new difference that is, I think, consistent with the homogeneity, heterogeneity point I make. So I guess what it comes down to is I would rather live in a messy, heterogeneous space where it's harder than just sustain self-contained elite spaces where you can perform a difficult conversation, but it's a very limited number of people who get to do it.
I think I fully agree with that. I would say that brings us to the whole point about the current or contemporary university and how different it is in many ways from those earlier colonial, despite its colonial heritage that we all a part of. And that is to say, if we take the diversity of our cities and our university campuses, and on that we all pride ourselves on, students from over 100 countries in the world. That kind of hyperdiversity is one that actually requires us to do something different about how we speak out loud together.
Because we can't assume that people know how to speak out loud together, or even that people, the cultural or other ways of engaging supports that. So it begs the question whether we in universities are providing opportunities and spaces for this. Yes. Yes.
I'll just say on that very point, this past September, as part of the programming involved with our Civil Discourse project, we hosted New York Times columnist Pamela Paul for an event on campus. She writes a lot about civil discourse and campus life. We had 200 first-year students show up. I don't know about it here, but that's a miracle at U of T to have 200 first-year students show up for an event. And I noticed two things at the end of the conversation. The first was right when the conversation ended, 40 hands went up with kind of excited, curious questions. And then in the reception we had afterwards, the number of students who said to me, when is the next one? There is a great desire, at least at the beginning. It seems to me that's why first year, first month programming is so important to kind of form and forge people to understand that this is the great right and responsibility of a university, that you get to go to these things that aren't for credit, but are somehow part of this shared enterprise that you are involved with, that you get to be involved with. I think that's what we have to encourage to overcome the challenge.
So then the elephant in the room, you mentioned it in terms of the conflicts abroad, and I alluded to the anti-apartheid struggles, which shaped my own academic career. Today, students are facing the conflicts, the various conflicts in the Middle East, but also not just the impacts that they are over there, they are here. Mm-hmm. And in effect, in a way, that's a reflection of the fact that our campus themselves are global. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. People have families and friends. The attachments aren't like, oh, that's happening over there. Mm-hmm. They are us in some ways. So what is it that universities need to do? And you're the one with the title in the country now, so it's on your shoulder. What are universities to do in order to kind of help us navigate that kind of, it's not just them, but us, but that them are us?
Yeah. Okay, I'll think about a few different ways that I can answer that. I think, and now I'm not speaking as the University of Toronto Civil Discourse Advisor, but just as
you can't wiggle out of this one.
Okay, I'll do my best. We need to stop making statements. I think statements are counterproductive to a university environment. I think statements have a direct causative relationship to civil discourse problems. It's harder for the two of us to disagree, but we can both at least get mad at the thing you're going to say on behalf of the university. And what do we know about statements? We know that they offend the people who are excluded, and then they tend to piss off the people included even more. They are radically insufficient as far as I'm concerned, and I think they crowd out the space for lowercase conversation. Lowercase is where statement making. So one thing I think universities should do is pull back from making statements, from trying to, because the other thing that it does, if you think about it, is it creates this perception that universities are these singular homogenizing actors, kind of striding the world, declaiming about this and that. And then suddenly they don't want to anymore. And objectively, reasonably, someone who spent years watching the universities make statements on this issue, that issue, and then suddenly it stops. Why is that? What happened? And it only encourages the worst kinds of suspicions, you know? So it seems to me that universities have to pull back from that to create space for others. And then the other thing that I think universities should do is be maybe a little less enthusiastic about technology. It seems to me that universities have been way too old people excited about social media and the adoption of technology. Let's break down barriers between traditional scholarship and public dissemination. We want you to go online and tell everyone what you think about your research and the world. Wait, no, not about that issue. No, stop. Now you're in trouble. It's very confusing, if you think about it, for faculty who have been encouraged, stop. So I think pulling back, acknowledging that maybe we overcorrected a little bit too much in these areas, will create, I think, lower temperatures on campus. It will redirect some of the expectations and demands that we have away from amorphous institutions or externalized platforms to spend more time like this. And then the hope becomes what? That something like what Dartmouth enjoys, we could enjoy, because now I actually know you, and I know that what I'm about to say is terrible because of your family, and I know actually that this is the case with your family because we've had more of a conversation instead of tweeting over here or both waiting for the university to issue a statement that no one will enjoy or like or agree with. So I think that's two institutional structural ways that I think we could address the problem of how permeated the university. That's the point, I guess. The university is so permeated by the world around us. Maybe universities could do a little bit to not help that problem along, if that makes sense.
So I just want to follow up on that point a bit about not making the statements, but less about, because in a way, and to bring it back to this conversation, if you make the statement on behalf of this heterogeneous and complex institution, sure, it's always going to fall short.
Oh, yeah.
There's no way you can actually square that circle or circle the square. Actually, you could circle the square, but not square the circle. Sorry. So
either way, it's difficult geometry. We can agree it's difficult geometry.
Thinking out loud together.
Yeah, there you go. Doing geometry out loud together, everybody. Go on.
But then the reason I say that is because then it doesn't put the university, because these are spaces of learning, imaginations. It puts the university in a position where it is better able to create those spaces, enabling spaces model for those conversations that is not complicated by its own statement.
Yes. Now I have to offer the counter argument. to be intellectually consistent, the counter argument, well, I think what you're describing in some ways is the idea of institutional neutrality. And this is most famously articulated at the University of Chicago through its Calvin report, and then what are known as the Chicago Principles, the idea being the university does not take a position on a given subject. The university creates the conditions for members of its community to take positions. Personally, I'm very attracted to this. This strikes me as a very sensible way for an institution to behave. But there's a reasonable counter-argument, which is that institutional neutrality is not actually neutral, that it actually sustains a status quo that keeps in place the very hierarchies and problems that people are trying to address through their scholarship, teaching, and even activism. And that seems to me like a pretty good counter-argument. At the end of the day, I'm still for institutional neutrality, but then the question becomes, if you reject the institution's neutrality, what do you do? And this is the tough question that each one of us has to answer as a university community member. A couple of months ago, I was in a conversation with a graduate student at U of T who was very upset about the university's announcing, re-articulating its rules about protest after the encampment finished. And these rules had to do with noise and had to do with, situating yourself in public land overnight, or university campus land overnight, yada, yada, yada. It was obvious why all of a sudden these rules were re-articulated. And I was chatting with a graduate student who was very upset about these rules and wanted to do something about it. And I said, because it's evidence of what? This is not a neutral space. These rules are ratifying an exclusionary practice when it comes to dissent. So I said to her, you have two options. You can protest from the outside, or you can join governing council and agitate from the inside for a change to these rules. And I said, I'm not going to put the thumb on the scale, but it's one or the other. Are you an institutional actor? I'm obviously an institutional actor. Do you work from the inside for the change you seek? Or do you want to work from the outside for the change you seek? It seems to me that even with a question like institutional neutrality, calling it out, there's two ways of doing it. And I think it's making a decision which way you want to go.
Okay, so we have, of course, less time than we probably wish we had.
What time does this go until?
Well, we just.
I leave for the airport at 4:00. I have no problem doing this until 4:00.
We will turn.
But if people need to go, I won't take it personally, and then everybody leaves. Okay, go ahead.
One question I have is related to this question of academic freedom, and the ways in which it is interpreted to, some would argue, to enable or disable discussions around human rights, equity, fairness, and justice. And I wonder, as part of your approach, I'm sure this comes up regularly enough, how do you navigate that conversation? I'm not sure how you reconcile it, but how you navigate it.
Navigate specifically what? The question of what is academic freedom?
Relationship between academic freedom and then this desire to have, and in your case, you're talking about epistemic humility.
So I think the question is, how do we understand academic freedom in relation to two things? Does academic freedom cover extramural expression? Does it cover your tweets? Does it cover the op-ed that you just published on a website? Are those things covered? I don't have a settled view on that question. I don't think universities have reckoned with that fully yet. How do we understand extramural expression? Again, mindful that universities have been encouraging of this. And, let's have our experts ready to go for the US election. Get out there, get out there, get out there. But what happens when you get out there and you say something that is upsetting or unsettling or is in conflict with what is perceived to be the status quo? Do you invoke academic freedom? Do you point to the fact that, hey, university, you're the ones who keep asking me to do this stuff? So I think there's an institutional contradiction there that I think leadership needs to address, at least to acknowledge and do something about, at least have a conversation about with faculty about that fact. I think that's one thing. And then the other is, how do we understand academic freedom in the context of our areas of knowledge? I have academic freedom to talk about Salman Rushdie. Do I have academic freedom to talk about vaccines? Do I? I don't know if I do. I don't have the disciplinary background to speak authoritatively, but I have the authority of being a tenured professor at the University of Toronto, and people are going to listen to me. And I think the challenge is something like this. It has to do, I think, with the ambivalence that faculty have about their institutional identities, right? We are all if you're a faculty member, you're this semi-autonomous actor, you have a great deal of freedom, and you have legitimacy that's conferred upon you in no small part by your association with the very institution that you have a lot of issues with. Putting it in a different way, if a guy named Jorge Bergoglio decided to tell you what he thinks about climate change, you're not going to pay attention. But if Pope Francis issues an encyclical on care for our common home, whose birth name is Jorge Bergoglio, you're going to listen. But you're not listening to this one-lunged 78-year-old Argentinian. You're listening to the office, right? There's a legitimacy that goes with the office. And so the office of being a professor has a certain significance in the world. But what it means to me is we need to use it as a right and understand it as a responsibility. I shouldn't be talking about vaccines. I don't know. I have too much respect for my colleagues who are public health scientists or epidemiologists for me to weigh in on something like that. So I think that's where academic freedom for me is, that's the limit case, is what is my actual credible authority relative to my position versus my actual expertise. They're not the same always.
So now, as a vice provost and associate vice president of research EDI, I have to ask you a question about equity, diversity, inclusion, or what is commonly referred to as diversity, equity, inclusion
in the US.
In the United States. And then if you're a critic, you probably say DIE instead of EDI or otherwise. You mentioned the University of Michigan case, and there's this whole discussion about these EDI infrastructures, offices, and whether they are seen, actually they are seen, they're perceived as somehow limiting freedom, academic freedom. And they are seen as kind of foreclosing the very kind of creative spaces and discourses we've been talking about. Now, I would love to know about these remarkable powerful offices. Most of the ones I know in Canada anyway are tiny and small and marginal and don't actually contribute to what you would call institutional discourse in that sense, right? So I'm trying to understand what accounts for the perception of this power, because it's assumption of power that these offices hold, in shaping discourse, civil or uncivil, authoritarian or otherwise. What accounts for that in the imaginary? I mean, I know the University of Michigan. I mean, I know the Michigan article, but I'm still seeing an incongruity between the perception and actually the lived reality of these offices.
I can tell you what I've, again, without attribution, I'll tell you what I've heard from hours of consultation at U of T when this has come up. And I would point to a couple of things. One would be, even if the offices are themselves small, their prominence at the level of institutional messaging is large. In other words, university leaders will invoke their commitments to EDI in broad public ways, more so than research and teaching is one thing perhaps that I've heard. So that's one way. The second is when it comes to the two ways that the question of decolonizing curriculum plays out. There's decolonizing curriculum, the concept of decolonizing the curriculum played out between faculty members in a discipline or a field who are responding, as we all should, to changes within the field itself. And then there are faculty members responding to what they perceive, often from kind of support offices, not an EDI office per se, but let's say like a teaching and learning support office, encouraging, providing resources, providing experts who are not faculty who are part of a department or the field with support for decolonizing. That doesn't feel, to the faculty that are responding on this front, freely decided upon. It feels proposed, almost imposed.
Impositional.
Yeah, and then the last thing I would say would be EDI statements when it comes to searches and the idea of expecting these in as part of job applications. I've certainly heard from a lot of faculty who self-identify as progressive on the left that this feels compelled. And the cynical view is it's compelled, and then you use ChatGPT to write something because everyone, quote, has to do this. We also get it from the federal government. If you think about some of the challenges with the way that the application of EDI principles when it comes to things like Canada research chairs is very difficult I say this as a university administrator, at the sheer level of numbers of finding faculty who fulfill certain categories. So I think, if you're just a rank and file faculty member not paying much attention, you probably just hear these things in a lot of different contexts. And that combined with a more public sense that you're fearful of getting something wrong, that would be where I'm noticing or hearing concerns with EDI.
And that sounds about right. Welcome to Alberta. No, but the reason I said it's actually important because that kind of conversation we think of as in the United States, but I think it's it's as relevant here. And it is precisely the kind of conversation you need to be having publicly, including heated conversations. And I think we avoid those heated conversations.
I agree.
Nonetheless, we are regrettably out of time.
No questions from here?
I am reading.
I am
reading some of their questions, and as I said, it's virtually impossible. Thank you all very much. To
they were submitted.
They by the.
Can I just tell you one thing before we end? Years ago, I interviewed Salman Rushdie at the Toronto Public Library when he came in town for an event, and it was Rushdie, and it's a public event, so it's high stakes. And God knows what's going to happen when it's time for the audience questions. So they said, no questions in advance. Sorry, no questions from the audience. Everything had to be submitted in advance. It was very old fashioned, no iPads. They were written down on papers and put in a hat, and I had to pull them out and read them, okay? So I interviewed Rushdie for 45 minutes, and it's over. And then I go, okay, now it's time for questions of the audience. These were submitted in advance. And I get this bucket of questions. And right before I start asking him questions, he says, no questions about India and no questions about my ex-wives. And then guess what every question was about? Because he'd been linked to Meg Ryan, and he'd just broken up with celebrity chef, I forget her name now, Padma Lakshmi. And so there was all these kind of gossipy People magazine questions for him. And I'm exhausted, 45 minutes with him. So I'm going, this one, the handwriting's bad. And I'm trying to come up with a new question in my head. So I get it completely. Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, so please join me in thanking Randy. And after such a conversation, I am so regretful that Dr. Andrew Sito is not here, who is the co-organizer for this and hosts Usually You Flourish. But I want to thank Sasha Savoy for all of her work with you and engaging with you. I also want to thank the staff, the venue, Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning. I want to thank the staff of the Office of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, all the volunteers, events organizers, and of course, the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. This was its first, Courageous Conversation was the first initiative launched out of that office, and it continues to have these kinds of conversations. So I thank you for coming. We hope to see you again soon. We hope this was a conversation that you found helpful, and you will have the courage. I'm going to come to you. We're going to have the courage to have these conversations. And I was going to say, since we draw on Maya Angelou, one of the things she said is we should think about courage like a muscle, which you have to exercise regularly. So it starts with little things, but if you keep doing it, it strengthens. And so we are not going to get the kind of campus or city or world that we want unless we have the courage to get to know each other, to find ways to build trust, and to actually have those difficult conversations in spaces face-to-face, preferably. You're not going to do it on Zoom or Teams. You have to do it. So, I hope we can find the spaces on campus and in our community to have these conversations. And to remember that at the heart of all of our conversations, we are dealing with fellow human beings, and that we all are deserving of dignity, and that our well-being is something that should be part of our mutual commitment to each other and to the cities we live in and to the world. So thank you for coming. Remember the big thought, and remember and appreciate Dr. Randy Boyagoda.